Welcome to the Midnightology Podcast, a place where we discuss macabre history, chilling bestiary, horrifying urban legends, visitors from outside our realm, and disturbing things that should only be mentioned during the midnight hours. Thanks so much for being here tonight. Tonight's show, I think everybody is going to really enjoy. We have with us tonight, who you might remember from our last podcast, the Cryptid Road Trip. We have Charlotte, who is a licensed private investigator, and we have Cameron, who has a master's in apologetics with an emphasis in cults. So thanks for joining us tonight, guys.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Good to be here, Ryan.
Really looking forward to this, and we'll get back to the show in a minute. I figured we'd start off, Cameron, by asking you to tell us a little bit about how you got involved in researching cults.
Well, I'd always been interested in. You want me to answer that now, right? Yeah. I'd always been interested in cults because I grew up in starting to become aware of things in the 70s when one of the big stories was Jim Jones and the tragedy in Guyana, and that just fascinated me. How a person like that who started out seemingly very sincere and a believer in Christianity, then suddenly was able to sway all of these people to follow him into just doing horrible things, and the control that he had over that. And then that led me to find out that there were other people that had done that too, like Charles Manson, and throughout the rest of the times, like David Koresh, and people who just had this control over people, making them think all sorts of things.
So for you, it's more about personal interest.
It was. That was what got me started in it, yeah. Studying cults and groups like that for years. Yeah.
Is there a standard definition of cults that everyone accepts? I mean, what defines a cult?
A cult is usually a group of people that center around a very charismatic person who has either some kind of a religious or psychological belief of some kind. Usually the person believes they're a messiah, or they have some kind of special knowledge that other people need.
And so does a cult actually just always revolve around one person then?
Yes, basically that's what it does. It revolves around one person who's very charismatic, who is considered the leader, who controls the lives of everybody who's involved, whether it's one person or, as in the case of Jim Jones, up to 900 or 1,000 people.
Do most cult leaders, do they have a specific type of personality type?
It would seem like it. They all seem to be to have an innate sense of how to control people. Here again, I guess the best word for it is charismatic. They're somebody. They make you feel like they're somebody that you want to be around. That they know what they're talking about. Perhaps a little narcissistic in their ability to think of themselves as divine. In many cases.
So tell us a little bit about how you went about researching all of this. I mean, to what extents did you go?
Well, mostly it started out just reading on my own, finding books and papers and things to read, and then I ended up going back to school and getting a degree in what's called apologetics, which is a branch of theology dealing with answering questions and objections to Christianity but it has a subset of it that deals with cults in particular and how to recognize them, how to talk with them, how to perhaps combat is a loaded term, but to deal with them on a basis of reason and what they're talking about.
So was the purpose of the course to, I mean, was the underlying purpose more about studying for some sort of religious degree, or like, was this a subset of the courses you were taking, or?
No, it was essentially, well, the cult section was a subset. It was essentially, as I said, a master's degree in what's called apologetics, which is dealing with theology. It's a branch of theology.
Mm-hmm.
And it deals basically, like I said, with answering objections. There's a lot of philosophy to it, arguments for the existence of God, the soul, that kind of phenomena. And then, as well, like I said, because there are a number of, there's a lot of it dealing with the study of the ancient scriptures and stuff like that, and how people can twist them around to their own uses, because very often cults, even non-Christian cults, will very often use ancient texts like the Bible particularly to make them seem like they're the ones that were talked about. There was a group called the Iglesia Ni Cristo. It's a Filipino cult that centers around one man who had convinced a number of people that he was the angel in Revelation who was come to give the last days message to mankind, and he was able to use the scripture verses in Revelation and some things that had happened in his life to make people think that he was in fact this angel or messenger who had been picked by God to give this last day's message. And he had a number of people following him, and as a matter of fact, long after his death, this group is still very popular and a major force in Philippine politics.
So it sounds like you did like a personal investigation into that particular cult. Was that?
I did, actually. Yeah, it was many years ago. I actually got the opportunity to kind of go undercover into the cult and find out about it. And I had convinced one of the ministers that I really wanted to be a minister in the group. And as a result, he gave me a bunch of information that the average member of the church didn't have about how to reach people, what their doctrines really believed, how to, twist people around when they were saying something, how to make them think something else, and that kind of thing. And I gathered all this information for probably close to a year with these people. And then during a big presentation they had where the gentleman who was the head from the Philippines, not the one who claimed to be the last day's messenger, he had long since passed away, but one of the people who was the head of the organization in the Philippines came to give a lecture and kind of a recruiting seminar, I guess. And at the end of that, I got a chance to meet him, and I started questioning him because I'd had the ability to know what they really thought or where their weaknesses were. So I caught him in that, and it was funny. Almost immediately, he just got angry at me, and he started screaming at the top of his lungs, "Who are you to question a prophet of God? And how dare you?" And he started pushing me around, and his bodyguards came and surrounded me and stuff like that. And I think the only thing that saved me was there was this young woman there, a little petite thing, that just plowed her way through and got between us. Was like, what kind of a religious leader are you if you're picking on somebody like that?
This sounds a little dangerous, almost like a Mission Impossible.
It was kind of funny, actually. After everything had settled down and they left, I was walking back to my car, and it was on the UC Irvine campus down in California. So it was a college campus, very dark, and a long way to my car. And another car started speeding up and coming along, and for a brief second, I'm like, oh, great, I'm going to get gunned down in the street of the college campus. But because actually the pastors of the Iglesia Ni Cristo are known to carry weapons in the Philippines. I don't know if they're allowed to here or not, but for a minute there, I was like, okay, this is it. But it was just a college student, I think.
So this was actually was it like a chapter that was on the campus?
No, they had rented out the UC Irvine not Coliseum. It was like like a basketball court where, had the bleachers fully surrounding it, stuff like that. And they'd rented that out as a place to have this recruitment lectures or series of lectures. And this guy came from the Philippines, and everybody that was a member of the church was supposed to invite a certain number of people to get them there and stuff like that. And then they were, as worked with most groups like that, they were very loving and accepting of everybody and wanted you to hear the good news and stuff like that. And they'd keep you there for a while. And then this guy would come out and he would talk, and he was himself very charismatic with the booming yet pleasant voice, and seemed like he had all the answers. He would ask a question and then give the answer. And of course, it's always easy to answer questions when you're the one asking them. So.
Right. Well, it seems like it would take a little time to infiltrate. I mean, to get in deep enough, so to speak, where you can actually learn anything that's not just available to everybody on the surface.
It did. I had to go there for quite a while. I would go on Sundays. They were an unusual group, a little scary sometimes. You'd go in to the church building that was in my neighborhood. There actually happened to be one there. You'd go in and they would close the doors, and they didn't have any windows. They just closed the doors, and they'd have guards standing at the door while you went through the about an hour-long service. Not unlike a traditional church service, except it was still mostly with people who would recite back what the guy, he would ask a question and answer it, and then people would recite back what he was saying. And it was a lot of the same doctrinal ideas over and over again. There was nothing new. There was no discussion. It was always just the same. It didn't matter what day you went. It was always the same thing over about. And it would all come back around to how this Felix Manalo was the last messenger of God, and the only way to salvation was by being a part of the church he formed. And it just didn't matter what subject you went to. It always went back to that. And then at the end, they'd let you out. But it was interesting. One of the times while I was there, before I'd actually gotten to the point where the pastor would start giving me these booklets and stuff, there was a local voting in the neighborhood. This was in Anaheim, California. There was a local voting for the Anaheim community. And they passed out papers about how you were to vote, which is not uncommon for some churches to do. Some churches get involved with local voting and stuff like that and give you suggestions on how to vote. But these weren't suggestions. They made it very clear that if you did not vote the way they told you on this paper, that you would be out of the church, and consequently, if you're out of the church, you're out of salvation. So it was mandatory. And it went all the way up to, even though this was a local election, I found out that it went all the way up to, leaders of countries and stuff like this. Like in the Philippines, they had to vote for whoever the church said they would have to vote to. That's how I say it's become quite a political power.
Wow.
And at some point, I mean, did they know the jig was up, so to speak? They knew you were not like a true believer.
The jig was up after I had confronted that gentleman at the UC Irvine. They knew then pretty much that I was not a believer, that I was questioning what they were saying and what they were doing. And I was just, after that, nobody would talk to me. They just close the door or hang up or anything if I tried to get back in touch with them. I was pretty much a pariah after that.
Yeah, persona non grata. So
exactly, yeah.
So at some point, I mean, one of the things that seems to be a feature in cults is that you often hear about people that are basically trapped inside, relatives and loved ones trying to get them out. Did you see anybody like that in your undercover stay?
I did. There was a woman who was attending there, and I had gotten a chance to talk with her on some of the Sundays, and we actually had another mutual friend, so we had something in common, and we would chit-chat. And I was able to talk to her over a period of a number of months and bring her out of the group and convince her that it wasn't the last, the only way to heaven, and that being inside this church, I was able to show her that it had cultic tendencies and mentalities and things like that. And she came out of it. But for a year or more after that, it was not uncommon for me to get a phone call from her at like 2 a.m. asking me, are you sure? Are you sure I'm not going to go to hell because I left that church?
Wow.
So they
Yeah,
really
yeah.
condition their people in order to
They
get
really
them to stay and participate.
Right, and that's what cults do. They will use a variety of techniques to condition you to believe what they want you to believe, but they impress it so deeply into your psyche and subconscious that it is very difficult to get out of it. It's so deep in there. They hang on to it for years afterwards.
Did they try any of those techniques on you?
Yes, I let them do some of the techniques. Like, I never questioned anything when I went there. I was dutiful and just followed along with what they had to say, nodded my head at the right moments, repeated verbatim back what they told me and stuff like that. But I guess because I knew what they were doing and what they were trying to do, it didn't affect me.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, were you ever scared to eat the food and drink the drink?
No, not there. I really wasn't. It had, by the time I had gotten into it, it had developed into quite a large group. I mean, it was in pretty much every state in the United States and everything like that. So it was not going to do anything of the nature of a Jim Jones or something like that. They were just out there to grow as much as possible and to bring people into the belief of following their church and their leader.
So, I mean, it sounds like they were fairly eclectic. I mean, it's a Filipino group, but I mean, obviously you're Caucasian. They didn't have any problem with that, apparently.
Oh no, they had no problem with that. It was still predominantly Filipino, but there were other. I guess we were all American there, but there were other, like you said, Caucasian, African American. There were a wide variety of people, just not many of them. It was still predominantly Filipino who was attending the church anyway, although there were quite a few of varying races at the seminar or at the lectures.
So I guess by their nature, cults then are not necessarily very racist.
No, I don't
picky.
think so. It just depends on the cult, I think. There are certainly some cults, I think, that do have racist tendencies. There's a movement called the Christian Identity Movement, which is very white supremacy oriented, and even while now that they've grown into more of a nebulous group, when they started out, they were following one individual and his ideas and things like that. So cults are so varied. They can be all the way, like I said, grow into thousands and thousands of members to just 3 people who follow one person.
So, in your opinion, I mean, of all the cults that you're aware of and that you've researched, I mean, is there one that kind of stands out in your mind as like, this cult is really the most dangerous cult? Or
currently, right now, I think there are actually a number of them, though I couldn't put any name on them, but there are just small enclave groups who have really gotten into the whole end times. This is, with things like COVID-19 and stuff like that, they grab onto anything that makes it look like society is finished, that we're done, and it's the end. And those, I think, are the groups that are dangerous, because when a group has an idea that the world is over and there's nothing left to live for, that's when it gets into the People's Temple or the David Koresh or the Heaven's Gate kind of danger.
So, and I'm going to direct this question at Charlotte. It sounds, if I remember correctly, you've actually had kind of a brief encounter with this kind of thinking.
Yes, only because of the type of work that I do. I work as a private investigator, working mainly with attorneys who take on criminal defense cases. So I help the attorney to talk to witnesses, work with their client who's been arrested for whatever their crime was. And a few years ago, I was called to work on a case where our client was a 74-year-old woman who lived with another woman as a roommate, and our client had been arrested for helping her roommate commit suicide.
Wow.
And it all came down to the explanation was that both of these women had spent many years as members of the Unification Church, which is also called the Moonies, is probably more common that people know it as. Both of the husbands of these two women had been in the Moonies group and had gotten their wives involved in it, and both women were now divorced and had claimed that they had left the Unification Church, but they had been in it for so many years that they obviously were still had that mindset, that almost mind control. And especially my client was completely under the control of her roommate, because the roommate claimed that she herself was a deity and that she had been on earth since the beginning of time, reincarnated over and over up until this point, and that she was now had completed her work on planet Earth and now needed to move on to her home in another universe. And so she had to kill herself to be released from this planet. And this woman had our client completely convinced that she really was a god, and our client was waiting on her roommate hand and foot, did all the cooking, the shopping, cleaning, gave over all of her money to support this woman, and in the end went out on the instruction of her roommate, went out and purchased 12 gallons of gasoline in town, brought it to their little mobile home. They lived in a senior mobile home park, and the roommate told my client, okay, you might want to gather a few of your things and leave the house because today might be the day. And apparently it was. My client left the house, went for a walk down the street, but when she heard the massive explosion and heard the fire truck screaming over to where she once lived, she knew that her roommate had lit herself on fire, just like she said she was going to. And our client, since she knew what happened, knew the whole story, she herself went to the police, turned herself in, told them the whole story. Not that she thought she had done anything wrong, because she still didn't believe her roommate was dead. So she couldn't have committed suicide because she's not dead. She's still alive. She's just on a planet in another universe.
Wow.
And she fully believed this. And she was the sweetest little lady, soft-spoken, well-dressed, just petite. You would not think of her as being a cult member who would do something like this.
So, I mean, essentially, this was a cult of just two people. I mean, just kind of a continuation of the Moonies, except the one roommate basically took on the deity figure.
Yes. So they didn't claim to be part of any group right now, though it was obvious that, and maybe because they had spent so many years under the control of a cult that was run by one person, the Reverend Moon. So obviously these two ladies were they were so used to being under someone's control that my client had no problem with believing that her roommate was a god and was ready to give up everything to follow her roommate's instructions.
Wow. I mean, I mean, this is a horrible tragedy. So when I say it this way, I mean, but it's fascinating that essentially one roommate basically took on the mantle of the leader and one the mantle of the follower in absence of not having that structure that was provided by the cult itself.
Yes. And maybe because they had been under this structure so long, they couldn't live without it, without that kind of severe structure. And my client, she had 2 grown daughters and I think a grandchild nearby in the area, but would make excuses to stay away from them. Well, I can't get together. My roommate needs me. I need to take care of her. She needs me 24 hours a day. So she voluntarily cut herself off from any family support. She had no friends.
Well, that's kind of the thing about cults? Don't they try to prevent familial relationships to continue?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because they don't want any outside influences that may be asking the people, "What are you doing? Why are you thinking this? What are you doing?" And the members of the cults themselves, they don't want to be questioned by anyone, maybe because they don't have an answer. So they will willingly cut themselves off from any friends and family.
So Cameron, are there any cults out there that you might classify as good? I mean, by their nature, I mean, if we're talking just the difference between good and evil.
I'm not sure I would, or that I can think of one. I won't say it's not possible. But anytime you run into a group that has too much emphasis on the leader and how you have to follow them, or like you were talking about, who separates you from family, who isn't willing to let you think for yourself, I just don't see as how that can be good. I think there's some that are more benign than others, but it just can't be healthy either way.
Well, and I mean, it's kind of fascinating because I mean, so many things you think of. I mean, especially in that religious sphere. I mean, a lot of people think, just Christianity on its own is a cult, or I mean, subsets like Catholicism or Mormonism. I mean, simply because of the rituals that are built in, and
sure.
I mean, and by their nature, I mean, whether you're talking about following Buddha or Christ or whoever it may be.
And I'll tell you the difference between a religion and a cult. I mean, sure, Christianity probably started as a cult. It was a group of people that were all hanging around Jesus. But the difference between what cults can become or world religions is that there's not necessarily one set way. And for instance, Christianity might claim to be the only true religion, but it's not saying that, you have to just be Baptist. Or you have to just be, there's diversity within the group. There's nobody's following one individual person. They all keep their eyes on say Jesus or God or something like that. But it's not one physical individual who's on earth now who tells them that they have to do everything and how they live. And that's really the difference, I think. Like I said, you can have within Christianity, you can have hundreds of denominations or different people who do things, or I can go to the church on Sunday, but if I want to go someplace else, they're not going to be that concerned about it if I believe something different than what they say 100%. Whereas a cult or a small group or a large group that's cultic, you have to obey this one person. You have to believe exactly the way we do. There's no change in that. You can't believe something different. You have to be a part of it and do exactly what we say, and that's really the difference.
And of course that brings up something interesting you just said. To my mind is there was a period of time when Catholicism and Protestants were at odds, and a lot of it dealt with the edicts of the Pope. I mean,
right. Yeah, there have certainly been times, I think, where any religious group, whether it be Christianity or Buddhism, there are certainly times where they exhibit cultic tendencies. I think that's probably one of the dangers you see within Christianity today is there are some places that will, and I think we're reading about them in light of the current quarantine and stuff like that. There are some people that will do whatever the pastor says. They give the pastor more authority than they do Christ, and then maybe that's what the Catholic Church was doing. They were giving the Pope more authority than he should have had, perhaps. I'm saying that from a Protestant standpoint. I'm sure somebody might disagree with that.
Right.
No matter what it is, whether it's Protestant or Catholicism, you're always going to find good and bad, but there's always going to be somebody who takes more control than they should, and that's when it starts moving into the area of cult.
Interesting. So then, strictly speaking, let's just talk about Satanists for a minute. I mean, the flip side of the coin. I mean, are they cultists, or are there subsects that would be cults?
There are subsects that would be called cults. Interestingly enough, Satanism, popular, the Church of Satan and stuff, don't really believe in what we consider Satan and the devil. They're more, on certain senses, atheistic in their thoughts. They're all about, doing what you want and living free and unfettered sexually, or in regard to food and drink, or really just doing what you want to do. But I think to be because the idea of Satan and it's the opposite of what Christianity would be as far as being a more austere lifestyle and not having sex outside of marriage, not doing these things. They take the opposite view that you should be doing all this. They don't really worship, in the sense, a being called Satan. It's all more about that. But there are a number of groups that are called self-styled Satanists, and in that particular instance, they do come up with ways of worshiping the devil as a being, and they will often follow a leader who will perform rituals designed to invoke the power of the devil and those kinds of things. And I think those are the dangerous ones that usually will spin into some kind of evil act, perhaps even going so far as murder. But
yeah, I mean, as a kid of the 80s, the 70s and 80s, it was really common, at least in law enforcement and in more secular circles, the 700 Club, whatever. I mean, there was a big movement at one point pointing at Satanists because there was little groups of primarily teenagers was the story. Like you had one kid and he got 3 or 4 kids, 5 kids, whatever. And they all kind of followed that one kid, and they would go out and sacrifice small animals and whatever in the woods. And is that, strictly speaking, that's kind of like a cult, right?
Yeah, that is. Yeah, anytime they're following, because in a situation like that, there's usually always one, as you said, of the kids that's more charismatic that gets the others to follow him. There was one in the 90s. Remember, there was a guy named Rod Farrell. He ended up being the youngest person on death row. And it wasn't satanic in the classic sense, but he convinced a number of teenagers that he was a 500-year-old vampire named Borges or Varagas, something like that, I can't remember. But in any case, he convinced them that he was a vampire, and he instituted this vampire cult where they would cut each other, they would drink each other's blood, and it culminated in them going to his girlfriend's parents' house in another state and murdering them with a crowbar. And he got these four kids to follow him and do that because they seemed to believe, anyway, that he was this, here again, 500-year-old vampire who was teaching them the ways of vampirism.
Wow. I mean, that's horrible. I mean, you wouldn't think a 500-year-old vampire would need a crowbar to kill anybody, but...
You wouldn't think so, yeah. But interestingly, actually, I was just looking him up a month or so ago for another talk I was giving, and apparently he has changed over serving time in jail. He's no longer on death row, but he's put out a plea to kids not to follow his line of thinking or what he did or how he got involved in this, to enough point, I believe, where he's actually convinced some psychologists who've been treating him that he is a changed person, that he really has come out of whatever it was that was holding him there or making him think these things.
Huh. I mean, it makes you wonder if it's just, that's just for expediency to just try and, get out of prison.
Know. But yeah, that's up to other people to try and figure out. And I don't believe they're planning on letting him out. But he seems sincere in the attempt to say, what he did was wrong and don't follow his path.
Well, that brings up a good question to Charlotte. The client that you were working with, how did that end legally?
She, her defense attorney wanted her to claim a diminished mental capacity, to say that she was crazy. And our client refused. She said, no, I'm not crazy. I know what I did, and I didn't do anything wrong. So, but I understand that the public would think that I did something wrong, so I'm ready to face whatever I need to face for consequences. So the case was settled without a trial. This woman's attorney was able to work with the judge to get a pretty lenient sentence, but the judge took into account a lot of factors, like that this woman had spent so many years in a cult and a controlled environment like this, and the fact that here our client was in her 70s and she had no criminal history before this at all, and that she had had a career as a pediatric nurse. So she just had so many positive things going on her behalf. Mm-hmm. So the judge was very lenient and sentenced her to 3 years prison time. And I believe it was, even after that, it was shortened by maybe a half of that time. So she would be out by this time, mm-hmm. and I don't know what she's doing. I'm hoping she's back with her daughters and grandchildren, mm-hmm. Because her daughters were supportive of her through the whole process. So I know they would have wanted her to come back into their lives once she could.
Mm-hmm.
So we have kind of a juxtaposition. I mean, a kid who thinks he's a 500-year-old vampire, at least at one point, and a lady who just basically is, just believing what she's being told, continuing on the Mooney tradition, I guess. I mean.
Yes, and as far as I know, she has not given up, or at least throughout the time I knew her, up to her sentencing, she never gave up saying that she knew she had not done anything wrong, and her roommate was not dead but still alive in another universe. Mm. So she never turned back on what she thought. Now I don't know, but
so that kind of brings me.
Their mind.
That kind of brings me to another question. I mean, so do rituals make the cult, or I mean, is it always just the personality that makes the cult? What makes the cult?
I think it is. I think what makes the cult predominantly is just this personality that can convince people to do anything for them. Because cults don't always have the same rituals. They will very often use ritual as a tool to get people to become less willing to ask questions or less able to think for themselves or that type of thing. but it's ultimately the person who is in control, who's the headmaster, the divine, the one with the secret knowledge that everybody needs, and you have to be a part of my group to get that knowledge.
So, I mean, it's because some cults believe that, as an example, their leader teaches the followers that, whatever endpoint, aliens are going to save them, in some form or fashion, or, maybe they believe in ghosts. I mean, I just to drag the paranormal into this a little bit. I mean, it seems like, so, I mean, you have some that are like real mainstream, like you might consider, in this case, you might consider Jim Jones real mainstream. He didn't talk about aliens coming to save anybody. And then you have Heaven's Gate.
Right, but it was still, even though the aliens were the ones who were going to save it, it was still the charisma of Applewhite who convinced them that these aliens were going to come and that they needed to kill themselves to be ready to jump on board the ship and be saved, or to find salvation. It doesn't always mean that the cult leader himself is going to claim divinity, but they're usually going to claim some kind of special knowledge or be a messenger of whoever's going to be the method of salvation.
So when the leader decides that he's going to, provide a message, I mean, I know that, like, for example, serial killers, they have a profile of a kind of person that they like to hunt, I guess is the way I put it. So, I mean, is the message kind of tailored to a certain kind of person? Like, do they think, okay, the people I'm after are going to be more likely to believe in aliens, versus another guy who says, look, I just want to take people who are basically Christian and supplant whatever they might take from the Bible and make them focus on me?
I think what cult leaders are good at, whether it's something that they just know inherently, they're good at finding people who are desperate, who are undergoing a hard time, who maybe have lost a loved one or feel inadequate or as though they don't belong, anything like that makes them feel like an outcast, or that life is over, nothing matters. They're very good at finding people who are in that state and then making them feel loved and accepted, and that there is hope for the future. And that's the way they make them feel at the beginning. And then as time goes on, then they begin to entrap them in things that they can't get out of. They've already taken them away from their family. They've already taken them, convinced them that they're the only way, stuff. But usually it starts with finding somebody who's just, and not somebody necessarily who's that way all the time, but just that point in their life where maybe they just have no place to turn to or nowhere to go, or something tragic has happened that's made them sad and they see no hope for the future.
So the message really isn't the key. It's who it's directed at and how it's crafted then. Right.
Crafting the message, finding people who are susceptible to it, and then over a period of time, basically training them, I guess, to be in the kind of mental state that they want them to be in, where they're dependent upon them.
So kind of like
willing to do whatever they want.
Kind of like a spider weaving a web. They just, they set up the trap, and whoever falls in, and then at that point they try to keep them there.
Right. Yeah. It's not like a snap of your fingers and boom, they're following. It's usually a drawn out process to get them to the point where they begin to give unquestionable allegiance to the leader.
So, in your experience, then, I mean, what would your, kind of a two-part question. I mean, first of all, let's break it down into how would somebody recognize, I mean, if they either had a family member that was getting involved or they were listening to a message themselves, what kind of things should they look out for to say, oh, this is a cult?
I think the most important thing to look out for is being isolated. If they start isolating you, if they start making claims that theirs is the only way, And here again, that's not in a religious sense, because religions will very often claim that they're the only religion, but that theirs is the only. Like, it doesn't. All others. We'll use Christianity as an example. The Iglesia Ni Cristo, the one I went to, their message was basically that all other forms of Christianity are corrupt. The only true one is ours. That's a big warning sign. And that could be. I mean, they've done that with Islam and Buddhism and stuff like that. There are groups that do that. It's just when you're in the only, when they tell you you're in the only group that matters and nothing else is right, when they tell you you need to get rid of your family, and when they tell you that, I've got some secret message or information that you need, then those are the three big signs that you need to,
Right. That you can only get that information from the leader.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so what about if now here's the second part of that. What if you already know you've got a family member or somebody you love inside a cult? How do you get them out?
That is actually a very difficult. It used to be, I know they used to have cult experts who would go and they would actually kidnap the person and do a form of deprogramming, not unlike how they were brought into the cult. But that has shown very little success, I think. In the long run, I think it's basically trying to remain close to them while trying to undermine the person's thinking toward the cult. And what I mean by that is, if you laugh at them when they say something, if you tell them they're wrong, they're just going to close up. But you have to still remain a loving family member, listening to them, maybe trying to help them see inconsistencies or that type of thing.
And what if you? And what if you can't have? You literally can't have contact with this person. They're just they're in the cult. You just don't know where, and you don't know if you'll ever see or hear or talk to them again. Is there any recourse?
I guess the best thing to do in that case would be to try and find somebody who can reach them, or at least find out where they're at. It's very difficult, unfortunately, if an adult says, I want to be someplace. The laws in the country say, well, that's their right.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not going to talk, the only thing you can do is hope that or ask somebody to try and reason with them or talk with them. It's been my experience usually in most things. Unfortunately, I don't know why this is true, but unfortunately, it's usually the family member who's not going to do good. We seem to have a tendency to not listen to those we love and are
Right.
closest to. But maybe somebody who's a third party could go in there and begin to talk or reason with them or something. It just depends on the cult. Like I said, if it was, say, the one Charlotte was talking about, where this lady was a part, even though she was cut off, there were at least opportunities to meet her. Some cults, like Jim Jones, they don't allow you in there. So how can you get back to them?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So at some point, it might even that might be why you would need to hire somebody like Charlotte to at least locate that person.
So at least locate them and find out where they are. Yeah.
So
a person who's undergone that is so entrenched in this leader's doctrine that telling them they're wrong is just it's not good. They're just going to close off. You've got to try and maintain that communication if you can get it, and just slowly try and show doubt, give them doubt why they shouldn't do that or why it's wrong.
So is that something that you actually do, Charlotte? And you said you're a licensed investigator. Is that something that you do?
I haven't had a call to do something like that. But trying to locate someone who really doesn't want to be found is nearly impossible. And once you find them, they don't want to leave the situation that they are in.
Right. But
so your hands are tied.
But but private investigators, that might be something they might take on, at least as locating the person to know where they're at, to at least know they're physically safe.
Mm-hmm. And by talking to their family or friends, acquaintances, try to find a last person who might have known where they have gone or knew that they were maybe dabbling into this strange belief or following a person. Just following up on any leads like that might take you in the right direction.
Well, I know that people, there's the statistics are just incredible. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's literally, I think, like thousands of people go missing every day. So how many of those end up disappearing into a cult? I mean, I could see a family member saying, "Hey, I want to locate, Joe, my long lost brother, and I don't know where he went." Maybe you might even find he ended up in a cult.
There's actually something going on in the news similar to that right now. I don't know. It's kind of fallen away with the coronavirus taking over most of the news, but there was a woman whose 2 children are missing, and the immediate family, like the grandparents, want to know where these children are. And they speculate they're either possibly dead, which is tragic, or they may be spirited away somewhere in the Idaho wilderness in an apocalyptic doomsday cult. So here you have these 2 kids that have been taken away, and the family doesn't know where they're at or how to get a hold of them. Or even if they're still alive.
I remember that. That was just recently. I think the woman was in Hawaii vacationing with her, brother-in-law or something, wasn't it?
Well, she was actually vacationing with her new husband of 2 weeks, who's probably the one who got her involved in the cult. This is an offshoot of the Mormons, but very apocalyptic, like I said, very end times. I believe they said the world's going to end in July of this year. And from what I understand, she was there kind of honeymooning with her new husband while her kids were gone, and nobody could get hold of them or find them. And she was ignoring an order from the court to produce the kids. And so they had to go to Hawaii, find her, and bring her back to Idaho. And she still refused to bring her kids to the forefront or tell anybody where they are.
Interesting that they picked July, I mean, in the midst of this COVID-19 thing.
Right.
But, okay, so, well, I guess I don't have a whole lot more. I mean, I could go on about this topic forever, but we're kind of coming up to the hard end of the show. I mean, in closing, I mean, is there anything that you would suggest?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I mean,
I was just going to say, the only thing I would say, I'd just reiterate, if you do find yourself with a loved one or something who becomes part of a cult, really the most important thing is to just try as much as possible to keep communication open. And hopefully if they leave the group, never take an "I told you so" attitude. Always be loving, always be understanding, and always help them, because if they leave the cult, they're probably dealing with a large number of emotions and wanting to kick themselves for getting involved in it. And you need to just keep the communication open and be as loving as possible, and never take a "ha-ha, I told you so" attitude.
Right. Well, and I suppose when you think about it logically, a lot of these people are kind of they're either in a really low spot in their life, or they're dealing with something that's emotionally or mentally damaging, and they might have even been thinking about suicide at some point, and this seemed like the lifeline. So you might even, I guess my advice also is, if you're in that spot in your life, maybe even calling us a suicide prevention hotline would, obviously be much better assistance than looking at getting involved in a cult.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are certainly a lot of professional avenues to take in that, dealing with all the onslaught of emotions and feelings and things that would come from leaving a group like that.
Okay, well, Charlotte and Cameron, thank you for joining us. I know we're going to have future shows soon. I mean, I think there's all kinds of topics we can talk about, but I sure appreciate you joining us tonight and talking to us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, it was a great visit.
Don't forget to check out our show notes for tonight's show at midnightology.com. And if you've had a paranormal experience, email us. Our email address is midnightology@gmail.com.